Sony has now introduced their brand new PlayStation 5 controller, and oh no, it's actually not called the DualShock 5 like we all believed, but instead it is called the DualSense. We got hundreds of requests to make a video covering it, but we've been extremely busy with some of our other content as a ton of products just got released during this period. But now that we're finally a bit more free, here are not just my thoughts on the PS5 controller, but also how it compares against all the previous controllers that Sony has ever released. So without any further ado, here is the history of the PlayStation controller. Get all the snacks ready because this is going to be one pretty interesting video. Sit back, relax, and let's take a look. Are you stuck indoors? Are you also bored and got literally nothing to do? Or maybe you just want to chill. Well, in that case, you can chill like a boss with Raid Shadow Legends, our sponsor for this video. Probably my favorite part about Raid Shadow Legends, aside from the absolutely incredible console quality graphics, is that you can play it on almost anything really. You can play it on your smartphone, you can play it on your tablet, and as a matter of fact, you can even play it on your computer. Yes, you can play Raid from your laptop or from your desktop PC. And then when you're on the go, you can just continue playing right from where you left off on your mobile devices, as Raid does indeed support crossplay. Raid works on Mac, Windows, iOS, as well as Android, and it's also free to play. So definitely try it out using the link below. And Raid is now launching tournaments. You can now compete against the entire Raid community while fighting against dragons and many other massive bosses. At the Spider's Den, the Ice Golems peak, and even fight the mighty Fire Knight. You will get increasing rewards from energy to silver, XP brew, and more. And now, in the brand new Raid patch 1.15 coming out in May, you will be able to compete in a brand new arena tournament and earn points towards improving your gear. Go to the video description, click on the special links, and if you're a new player, you'll get 100,000 silver plus one free champion, the Grumbler. All this treasure will be waiting for you right here. Now, these rewards will only be available for new players and only for the next 30 days, so yeah, hurry up. Number 1. The PlayStation 1 controller. Originally released back in 1994, the PlayStation controller was Sony's very first gamepad that they have ever released. And they bundled this with the original PlayStation. It was based on the Nintendo Super NES controller's design, featuring 4 directional buttons and 4 action buttons, but you see, instead of Sony using letters for their action buttons, they decided to use shapes. We had X, circle, triangle, and square, where X would represent a yes, circle would represent a no, the square button would actually represent a sheet of paper, and it was originally designed for being the info button in games, and then the triangle button would represent a point of view, or the dialogue button in games. Yeah, interesting. However, unlike Nintendo's Super NES controller, Sony decided to add a second pair of shoulder buttons. So in total we had 4 with L1, L2, R1, and R2. Fun fact, the US variant of the PS1 controller was actually 10% larger, to account for the larger hands that the average American had compared to the average Japanese person. Now, you might have noticed that something was missing from the original PS1 controller, and that something were the joysticks. Well, they were in fact added in 1997, 3 years later, when Sony introduced the new dual analog controller. This was, for the most part, just a PS1 controller, but with dual joysticks added to it, for more refined controls in games, according to Sony. The shoulder buttons were now larger, especially the R2 and the L2 buttons, but more importantly, Sony also added an analog button, which was used to switch between different modes. There were 3 modes that this controller had. There was the digital mode, which disabled the joysticks, then we had the analog mode, which enabled the joysticks, and then finally we also had an analog joystick mode, which emulated Sony's separate analog flight stick accessory. The dual analog controller was indeed a pretty big upgrade, and really the first ever upgrade we ever got in a Sony controller. Then, in the same year of 1997, but in November compared to April, Sony released another controller, which they called the DualShock. The main change from the dual analog controller was the fact that Sony added vibration feedback in order to immerse you more into the game. Now, each game had to support vibration feedback on things such as, I don't know, punching a character, or doing an action in a game like opening the door, and so on. Actions like this would then trigger the vibration. Nintendo already had this with the N64's Rumble Pack, but Sony decided to step it up a notch by adding a vibration motor in each of the hand grips, for a total of 2 rather than just having one main vibration motor. Not only that, but these 2 motors didn't require a separate battery to work like Nintendo's Rumble Pack did, but instead they just worked inside the controller and they were powered by the controller's cable. So that was pretty big. Games started implementing vibration support heavily, and we all know how important this is today. The other change that the DualShock brought to the table were even bigger shoulder buttons compared to the dual analog. Next up we had the DualShock 2. Originally introduced in 2000, the DualShock 2 was launched alongside the PlayStation 2. The main change, and you can probably tell this as well, was that the entire controller was now black, as opposed to gray, like we had since the original PS1 controller. Aside from this, some users reported that the vibration motor felt stronger in the DualShock 2, although this was never officially confirmed. But we did indeed get something which was pretty awesome, and that something were pressure-sensitive buttons. So essentially, aside from the joysticks and the start, select, analog, L3 and R3 buttons, the rest of the buttons, so the triangle, square, X, circle, L1, L2, R1, and R2, as well as all the directional buttons, were all pressure-sensitive. Meaning that rather than just registering a value of 1 when pressed, it would register anything between 0 and 1 from the moment you rested your finger on it. This was incredibly useful in racing games where you could accelerate just a tiny bit by only lightly pressing on the shoulder button. So yeah, pretty amazing stuff. Then, in 2006, with the introduction of the PlayStation 3, Sony launched the DualShock 3. No, just kidding. It was actually called the 6-axis controller first. Design-wise, it looked almost identical to the PS2 controller, which was released 6 years prior. But you see, the biggest change here was that it was fully wireless. You still had a cable that you would use for charging, and you could keep it connected to the console if you wanted to do so, but the controller itself could now be fully used without any cable at all, and it would just work as well as before. On top of this, Sony added 6-axis motion sensing technology, hence the name, to their 6-axis controller. This meant that a controller could actually feel rotation and translation across the X, the Y, and the Z axis, allowing you to, for example, control a car by just using the controller as a steering wheel, or control a plane by using the controller like a yoke. Is that how it's called? You know, the thing that I used to fly a plane? A yoke? Anyway, you know which one I mean. It was overall pretty cool. Now, unfortunately, the 6-axis functionality didn't end up being used as much as Sony would have wanted. Even to this day, 14 years later, there are very, very few games that do take full use of that. Also, fun fact, 6-axis was a palindrome, meaning that you could reverse the word and it would still spell 6-axis. And fun fact number 2, Sony actually removed the famous vibration motor entirely from that 6-axis controller due to a patent dispute that Sony was having with a different company. Now, aside from this, the analog button was replaced by a PlayStation button, which would just take you home, and then the 6-axis controller also included finer shoulder button precision compared to the DualShock 2 controller. Next up we have the DualShock 3 controller. Less than a year after the brand new 6-axis controller launched, Sony finally managed to settle that patent battle against Immersion, the company that sued them, and thanks to this, they could actually use that vibration feedback once more in their controllers. So, Sony released the DualShock 3, which was really just a 6-axis controller with that added vibration feedback. Aside from that, it was pretty much identical to the 6-axis. Sony did end up releasing new colors for the DualShock 3 controller, including white, which looked absolutely stunning, making this the very first time Sony would release multiple color variants of their controllers. Then, in 2013, when Sony launched the brand new PlayStation 4, they also launched, the DualShock 4. And unlike all the previous controllers, which all look pretty much identical to one another, the DualShock 4 was the first major change ever in a PlayStation controller. The handles were now more rounded, longer, and overall the entire controller itself was much more comfortable to hold and use when compared to any of the previous models. The joysticks were now concave as opposed to convex like the previous ones were. Personally, I did find them way more comfortable to use when compared to DualShock 3 ones, for example. But aside from this, the DualShock 4 also had some other gigantic changes. So it removed the start and select buttons and added a massive touchpad instead, which could recognize multiple fingers at the same time. So this was a capacitive rather than a resistive touch surface. And the touchpad was also pressable as well, so it acted as an extra button. But unfortunately, just like the 6-axis motion sensing technology, the touchpad itself didn't really get used by games at all. Aside from very few exclusive games such as Little Big Planet, for example, and Astrobot VR, aside from these ones, most games use it as a button for the map or the high score, essentially acting just like the tab key does on PC. Then the other big change was on the back of the controller, where we had a pretty massive LED strip. The main purpose of this was so that the PlayStation 4 camera could track its movement. And you could use it in some games this way, so the controller would actually transform into a character in this AR experience, which was really cool. And then following the PlayStation VR's release, that light was also used by the PlayStation 4 camera to track the movement of the controller in VR. Aside from this light would also change its color based on certain events in a game. For example, if your health would run low, the light would turn red, but if you were at full health, the light would be green. Not only that, but a PS4 controller also added a speaker for sound effects. It also added a proprietary connector for connecting things such as a keyboard attachment or the new back button attachments, and it also added a 3.5mm headphone jack, which essentially allowed you to connect any headphones that you wanted, and you could hear the audio from those games directly through the controller, with no noticeable lag at all, which was pretty amazing. This was so incredible and definitely my favorite feature ever in any controller. We also got a new options button for bringing up the options menu in games, as well as a new share button for taking screenshots and also video recordings of your gameplay. We also got a micro USB port from the mini USB port that we had on the DualShock 3 controller. And then Sony also expanded on the success that the color version of the DualShock 3 received by releasing even more color options for the PlayStation 4 controller, as well as limited editions of the PS4 that also came bundled with a limited edition controller. All these improvements made the PS4 controller, the DualShock 4, a massive technological leap compared to its predecessors. Then, in 2016, when Sony launched the PS4 Pro, they also released an updated version of the DualShock 4. Now, it was still called the DualShock 4, by the way, but this was the PS4 Pro version of it, or version 2.0, which now reflected the light bar onto the touchpad as well, so that you could see it more easily, and it also included the ability to use it via a wired USB connection with even lower latency than when connected wirelessly. And it also featured an improved battery life. And finally, the last and most recent controller that Sony has introduced was the PlayStation 5 controller. But you see, interesting enough, rather than this being called the DualShock 5, like, everyone expected, yeah, it was called the DualSense. Design-wise, just like the DualShock 4, the DualSense embraces a completely fresh design style, this time coming in a dual-tone color scheme. The one that Sony has showed us came in white with black accents, but we do expect Sony to launch even more color options, likely a black controller, maybe with white accents, and maybe a few other color variants as well. That would be pretty cool. Now, aside from the color scheme, the shape of the controller is now different as well. So it resembles the Xbox One controller much more than ever before. It is bigger, heavier, and overall, according to Sony, it feels more premium than ever before. We still have the same buttons as before, the directional keys, as well as X, circle, square, and triangle, but all of these buttons have a glass enclosure. Again, similar to how they look on the Xbox. So yeah, gone are those colored action buttons that we've seen for so many years now. The options and the share buttons are still there, however the share button has been renamed into the create button, but it still acts in the exact same way. And they have been rotated slightly, as you can see, to make room for the larger touchpad. This one still has the built-in LED light, but it now surrounds the touchpad rather than being underneath the touchpad. Now, in case you're wondering about the back LED light, this one now seems to be gone entirely, which means that the PSVR 2 will very likely use a very different tracking technology than LED-based. So we've seen multiple patents from Sony on this, where Sony would be using a laser-based tracking system for the PSVR 2. But yeah, anyways, that's not set to be released until 2021 at least. Another change that the DualSense comes with is USB Type-C from the micro USB connector, meaning that now you can use a phone charger as well as a laptop charger or pretty much anything that's USB-C to charge the PS5 controller. The battery life has been improved significantly according to Sony, and they've also added onboard microphones, meaning that you can now chat even without having a microphone plugged in. And of course that the 3.5mm headphone jack, that one is still there in case you want to connect to your own headphones. Okay, now let's talk about the big changes here that will actually affect your gameplay. And the first one would be the brand new adaptive pressure sensitive L2 and R2 triggers, which, just like pulling a bowstring or an actual gun trigger, they will be harder to push the further you push them down. Now, this sounds very similar to what Microsoft added in their brand new Xbox One controller. And now, the biggest change, and literally the reason why this is called DualSense, is that it features a full haptic engine all throughout the controller. Okay, but what's that? So you know how on modern smartphones such as the iPhone 11, the Pixel 4, the Samsung Galaxy S20s, the OnePlus 8, and many others, we have an improved vibration motor that gives you a tactile response whenever you press a menu or an action button, essentially giving you the impression that you pressed a physical button on the screen. While the PS5's haptic feedback would be similar, just on, steroids. According to Sony, the haptic feedback is actually so good that you'll be able to feel the textures on different roads. You'll be able to feel mud, asphalt, ice, and even more, and even feel how different guns actually shoot in a game. And from what I've heard, this is an absolute game changer. So there you go. This is how far we've come from the original PS1 controller, and I'm personally really looking forward to trying out the PS